Howdy goons, minions, and soon-to-be servants of the Nimzy Nova Empire. I need to beat the Nintendo Glazer allegations real quick. I have a lot of video game systems, and Nintendo makes up only a fraction of that. Not that you never know, because I've only been posting Nintendo stuff lately because the Switch 2 is about to come out. But I thought since my other channel doesn't do gaming stuff anymore, I'd remake this video about the Game Gear and put it here. If you're more here for Switch stuff, I just ask that you please give this video a shot because you'll see that Nintendo borrowed a ton from the Game Gear for the Switch. Also, if you've seen this video before, I did change the background stuff and I rewrote some of the script and I added an extra section, so it might be worth the rewatch. Howdy goons, the only thing more alien than me may be this handheld that I'm talking about today. This is the Sega Game Gear and it's a bit of an oddity. It's 100% proof of the fact that a good idea at the wrong time is the same as a bad idea. That's because everything we love about the Switch is here and present in the Game Gear in a prototype form, but Sega was a little too ambitious. They tried too much, too early, and the technology just wasn't there yet. This thing is practically held together by chewing gum and rubber bands. All gameplay shown today, by the way, is emulated because, as you'll soon see, these things don't walk, let alone run. As is common with Sega, the source of our system is their early days marketing strategy of directly calling out their competition. Sega had the superior hardware, a chip on their shoulder, and a hate boner for Nintendo, and wanted everybody to know it. The Game Gear is a portable, in air quotes, gaming handheld, also in air quotes, that was supposed to stick it to Nintendo and their Game Boy. See, even back all the way in 1989, the Game Boy could have easily had a backlight, or better graphics, but they just simply chose not to. The Game Gear had a full-color display, 8-bit color games, a backlight, and a sleek black design. The Game Boy had a sickly pea-green screen, black pixels, and was ugly. The mature look of the Game Gear immediately told you this wasn't your mom's Tetris machine. The Game Gear was a portable Sega Master System, whereas the Game Boy was nowhere near a home console. It was much worse than the other systems by Nintendo at the time. Its only benefit was its portability. This was 6 years after the NES, so they had the time to figure it out. Nintendo likely did this to save on the overall cost. The NES was $200, and the Game Boy was offering similar experiences, but it needed to be smaller and with a smaller price, just $90. That puts the home console at $400 today, and the GB at $200. Sega knew that it was possible to offer console-quality gaming experiences on the go without sacrificing anything, and they sold it for $150 or $300 in nowadays money. That puts it neatly between the GB and the NES. By this point, though, the NES was getting ready to get phased out, and gamers were ready for the next thing, and they had the choice of the 16-bit Genesis or the Game Gear. This window wasn't long though, as the SNES was due to come out that month. So Sega did what they best, and they talked trash. It didn't matter that they didn't have the same game support that Nintendo did and wasn't as affordable. Sega had the superior hardware, and they thought that was all they needed.
We at Sega have learned that some people are actually throwing their one-color portables away. We urge you to stop.
There are still many practical uses for them.
Fix a wobbly chair. Look, a cat massager. Spread cheese snacks.
We at Sega admit we may have an unfair advantage with Game Gear being a full-color portable with tons of new games. This is still no excuse. Use them to tenderize meat, or even as sunblock. Please, help save the planet.
Sega! Now, if you know anything about the Game Gear, that aged like fine milk. Game Gear, despite being the superior hardware, lost the gaming arms race, and Sega and Nintendo shifted their console wars to a new front. 16-bit home consoles, the Genesis versus the Super Nintendo. But that's a different video. We're talking about the Game Gear. So let's compare. The Game Boy, despite being very big, has small grips, opting for a vertical layout that some gamers just don't like, myself included. Even when the color came out, Nintendo stuck with this same vertical design. Game Gear was wider, with a horizontal layout. It was made for adult-sized hands, immediately setting the tone of this system as the handheld for big brothers. And 90s kids wanted to play what their brother was playing, not some dinky kids console. The Game Boy had a nearly square screen, a practically 1:1 ratio. The Game Gear had a 4:3 ratio, like televisions of the time. Both had 2 buttons, but the Game Gears were concave, having more grip. The directional pad was also disc-shaped, which is pretty dang terrible, but Sega fans say they actually like this directional pad. You know, there's no accounting for taste. The Game Boy was a green screen with black pixels, no backlight. had horrible ghosting when games were going fast, and was generally pretty unpleasant to look at. The Game Gear had a full-color display with 8-bit games, so it was backlit. It still had ghosting problems, but at least it was ghosting problems in color, and a sleek, mature black exterior. It was much bigger too. It was a home console, but portable in the loosest of senses. It was powerful too, needing 6 AA batteries to run, but came with a DC adapter to plug into the wall when you're at home. Everything about it said, I'm the console for big kids. The Game Boy is just another toy. Alright, so I'm talking about this in the sense of it being a post-mortem, so what's wrong with it? It sounds like a better Game Boy. Well, the price was a big contributor, but pretty much everything good about it had a drawback. It was big, way too big. It was not portable in even the slightest of senses. It would not fit in even the most cargo of shorts. It was also almost as wide as the Switch, but nearly 2.5 times as thick. Its beautiful screen meant a high power cost, and 6 AA batteries could not keep up. It had a battery life of just 4 hours. Just like the launch Switch. Wow, crazy how Nintendo can copy the Game Gear and succeed. Probably has to do with the better game selection and not having any competitors in the handheld space. If only some sort of budget console would come out at like $100 or $150, it would just absolutely annihilate Nintendo, especially right now. Anyway, the Game Gear had games that you could already get on the Genesis or Master System, but the ports from Master System are near identical to their originals, making them some of the best ports out there, because you can take them with you. The system also had barely any RPGs in English. Meanwhile, Nintendo had Mario, Pokemon, Zelda, and many titles unique to the Game Boy, or at least, that's the most common misconception. The Game Gear had many exclusives, or games that came to it first, but overall, the Game Boy was just supported better. Now to get into the problem that is so bad that it continues to persist to this day, long after the console's death. The Game Gear was rushed out, leading to a lot of component failures similar to the Xbox 360 and its Red Ring of Death. Just saying the Red Ring of Death just made the millennials in the audience flatline. The Game Gear is notorious for having screen failures and busted capacitors, but now that most of us have learned how to repair capacitor issues, those many Game Gears are dying to their secondary failure point: busted or corroded cartridge slots. So that's bad capacitors, bad screens, bad audio, and bad cartridge slots, meaning in a single console's lifetime, one might have to full-on ship of Theseus, leaving only the ship's keel, the motherboard. But with modern advancements like FPGA, which emulate chipsets with hardware, we may choose to not bother repairing old ones and just make new ones instead. Basically, anyone who buys a used Game Gear knew that they were going to have to do some sort of repair with it. At the absolute minimum, you would need to replace the capacitors. That's because the capacitors are electrolytic. They leak and corrode over time. If that isn't annoying enough for you, the capacitors are in a plastic housing that's glued to the board. So when you remove them for repair, the plastic may not fully come off, meaning you have to burn it off with the soldering iron. Okay, enough of me problems. Back then, the capacitor issue wasn't a problem. This was an issue that came with time. Nowadays, though, most will self-repair their Game Gear. I taught myself to solder just for this repair. When I used to work as a technician, 90% of my job was just plugging in ribbon cables. Anyway, this rushed manufacturing process led to that brag-worthy screen breaking, or the capacitors breaking, which meant no video or sound, and this did not have video out. While the system itself did have some issues, I do think it had good software. Many fans seem to think so too. Despite not beating the Game Boy, it's still among Sega's best-selling systems. I think because most people got the Game Boy, we had this very Nintendo-centric view of history, because you know the saying, the winner gets to write history. Let's take a look at some of the great games you missed out on. We'll go by genre so that you have some places to start based on your own personal tastes. Role-playing games. The category of games that I personally care about the most. While the Game Gear had a very paltry amount of RPGs that launched in English, the system had quite a few great RPGs that probably you've never played. Some of these titles that were previously Japanese only got brought back with the Game Gear Micro, a super small version of the Game Gear released for the Game Gear's anniversary. There were 4 color versions that had 4 different games. The ones for this genre are blue, yellow, and red. On blue, you had Sylvan Tale, Sega's answer to The Legend of Zelda. Yellow had Shining Force, The Sword of Haja, Shining Force Gaiden Ensei Yashin no Kunihei, and Shining Force Gaiden Final Conflict. Then red had Megami Tensei Gaiden Last Bible. That's right, the same Last Bible that was on Game Boy was here and in full color. but most of these games never came to the US besides Shining Force Sword of Haja. There's also Magic Knight Rayearth, and that even had a special red system to match the cart. Magic Knight Rayearth as a game is pretty cool because it's based on an anime of the same name by Studio Clamp, the all-women studio who made Cardcaptor Sakura. The original could be played on the SNES or Sega Saturn, but the sequel is Game Gear only. You don't need to watch the anime like me to understand the games, because the first one is entirely an alternate story from the anime, and the second one, you really only need to watch the first couple of episodes to learn who the characters are, but that's because the game isn't fully translated yet, it's partial translated. But the cool thing about the Game Gear is that it's not region locked, so if for some reason you had Japanese carts, you could play them on your American or European GG. Many more role-playing games were fully translated into English and are fully playable now. I know people have been talking a lot about first-person dungeon crawlers a lot lately, so now's a good time to mention the Mado Monogatari series. Mado Monogatari is a first-person dungeon-crawling RPG that's a little difficult, it's a little hard to understand, you're gonna want a little bit of a guide at least to get started, but it's very cool. This series, there's 3 of them, is made by Compile, who later became Compile Heart, one of my favorite devs. That's the team that went on to make Hyperdimension Neptunia and a lot of other RPGs, so these guys have experience dating in the decades. I personally love the Neptunia series. The only thing that kept me from playing them before was living on ad revenue. They're not exactly a super popular franchise because it delves into the weirder parts of anime. As for English releases, we have Axe Battler, A Legend of a Golden Axe, Shining Force Sword of Haja, and Defenders of the Oasis. Yeah, it's that few. Not even, well, technically a few, but not even really a few. This means that these games are on the more expensive side for physical, but the thing about Game Gear, expensive still only means $40, that's still pretty cheap. But the fact is that no one is really nostalgic for this system. The people who collect them mostly collect them for the weird history factor. For many collectors, it's like finding an artifact from an alternate history, since they likely went with Nintendo at its release like everybody else. Axe Battler is like Legend of Zelda 2. It's top-down until you get into combat, then it's a platforming RPG. It's kind of funny because Axe Battler is a sequel to Golden Axe Warrior, which was copying Zelda 1, so they even copied with weird sequels. Defenders of the Oasis is more of a traditional Final Fantasy style role-playing game, Shining Force is a tactical role-playing game, and it's a sequel to a game that we didn't get. At least there's variety. This is still 3 very different styles of RPGs. We have a lot to get through though, so let's keep these short. Let me know if you want more details about any of these, but for the furry fans out there real quick, you might want to take a deeper look at Shining Force. There are fox people, centaurs, birdmen, beastmen, and a canid-like race called the Kian Tol. Puzzles. Alright kids, you got your exciting RPGs, it's mom game time, get out of here. Baku Baku Animal is a puzzle game series that started on the Saturn and was brought over to the Game Gear. In Baku, you have falling food items like bones, carrots, bamboo, and bananas, and instead of matching them with each other, you match them up to the animal that consumes them. The goal is to clear out the animals, so it's kind of like Dr. Mario. If you're in the Puyo mood, you can pick up Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. It's essentially just Puyo Pop with a Sonic the Hedgehog aesthetic. There are many instances of puzzle games that get reskinned because they think that US audiences wouldn't like the Japanese originals and their settings, so they take characters popular in the West and reskin the puzzler to help it sell better. Mean Bean Machine is one such instance, but you might also be familiar with Pokemon Puzzle League actually being Tetris Attack. Speaking of Tetris, we have Columns. This one was made in response to Nintendo acquiring Tetris. Sega believed that they held the rights, but it turns out they were lied to and sold fake rights to the arcade and home console versions, so after losing, they made Columns. Columns, however, is nothing like Tetris. Columns is more like a match 3 puzzler, but you drop the blocks in. You'll get segments of 3 gems dropping as a block, and rather than rotating, you'll be changing the location of the gems within that 3-gem column. You're trying to match 3 or more in a column or diagonal with a focus on making chains. If you play the Super version, there's a story mode. But a really cool sort of puzzler. I didn't really know where else to put this one, because this one doesn't really fit in any of these categories, but it's called Devilish. It's like Brick Break, but you get multiple paddles, and you can change the formation of the paddles to make it easier or to have more control over your angles. I really like this one. This is a very good toilet game. The neat thing about this one is as you clear blocks, the screen moves forward rather than getting a new stage. It's very strange and a very fun form of Brick Break. But the most interesting puzzler has to be Magical Puzzle Popples. If you remember Pushmo, you might like this one as the premise is pretty similar. You break blocks with your little feller to try and get your girl. But unlike Pushmo, there are enemies and spikes to avoid. Fighting games. This is one of the categories that the Game Gear doesn't shine the brightest at. There are better systems for Mortal Kombat, Primal Rage, Fatal Fury, and Virtua Fighter. Honestly, no fighting fighter is going to look good on this. The sprites would have to be huge to properly convey the detail. Then you still have the problem of ghosting and the cramped screen. The WonderSwan, another system I love, got around this problem by using chibi character models, but Sega was trying to look like the big kids console, and chibi doesn't fit that vibe. All of these look pretty terrible on the Game Gear, and the Game Gear only has 2 buttons, meaning any fighter moving to the system would have to water themselves down in some way. This is more one of those things where it's like, if you had the Game Gear and nothing else, it was better to have this than nothing. Platformer. You already know this baby is a Sonic machine. 7 Sonic the Hedgehog games are on here, but it's hard to recommend any of them because they're all ports, which means they were better on the Genesis. But GG also has Mega Man, which is its own title. It's sort of like Mega Man 5 in gameplay, but it's its own game. Ninja Gaiden Game Gear is its own unique entry while still retaining the classic hard as balls Ninja Gaiden gameplay. Brave of them to put such a hard game on the world's most fragile console. It's just so throwable, and of course there's lots of licensed titles like Alien, Aladdin, and Lion King. While many don't like licensed titles, I know a lot of people who really like Aladdin and the Lion King. The favorite among the Game Gear though, for platformers at least, is Mickey's Illusion. Despite being a Disney game, they very clearly understand what a character action platformer is supposed to be for this one. It's very reminiscent of other platformers while still being its own unique thing. Tails Adventure is a great choice too. It's a game just for Tails. You won't be going fast like Sonic, or doing much running at all. Instead, you'll take a slower, more methodical approach while throwing bombs and spending more time exploring. My favorite has to be Shinobi though. I don't much care for platformers, but the music here is really good. Those of you who know me know that when I played Game Boy Advance as a kid, I actually always had the system muted because everyone would complain about the sound. But I also don't have much of an ear for music. I really only notice the music if it's really good or really bad, and Shinobi's music is great. It makes for such an epic experience that really just elevates the game. Action-adventure games. Sylvan Tale is an easy suggestion. Some might consider this an RPG, but people consider Zelda an RPG? I don't. Sylvan Tale is fan-translated and able to be played by English-speaking audiences now. You might not be able to play it on your Game Gear without a flashcard, but it's worth checking out emulated. It's very close to Zelda being a top-down action-adventure game with lots of dungeon puzzling and combat. The sprite work is also absolutely gorgeous. It almost doesn't look 8-bit. Master of Darkness is clearly ripping off Castlevania, but I'll let it slide because they did a great job with it. It's super easy to overlook because its box art is not great, it doesn't really pull you in, but it has nice sprite work, looking very dark and moody even for a Castlevania style game. This one plays like classic Castlevania though, don't expect RPG elements. This genre overall is a pretty hard one to recommend for because the vast majority of the library is action games. There's just a ton to choose from. There isn't a shortage of action games for you to play on the system. Shooters. Let's start with the exclusive game, Tails Sky Patrol. Sky Patrol isn't really a shmup, not in the traditional sense. Tails has a fuel meter that you refill with candies, and he shoots out a ring to hit enemies and grab items. If he gets hit, he'll start to lose altitude, and if you hit the ground, you lose a life. It's only 5 stages, and it's pretty forgiving. If you run out of lives, you have infinite continues, and you'll only restart from the beginning of the current stage. The most popular shmups on the system, though, are GG Aleste 1 through 3. These are also made by Compile. It's a great game and probably the best shmup you could do for the system, but I don't much care for vertical shmups that are on a horizontal screen. It just feels way too cramped. Now, if you're looking for a very weird and very, very expensive experience, there's Panzer Dragoon Mini. Bust out your flash cart for this one, as it costs more than a Switch 2 with Mario Kart and a controller. Panzer Dragoon Mini is a reimagining of Panzer Dragoon. It's smaller, easier, pixel art, and cuter. This one was shooting for the younger audience. At first, gameplay has you moving forward as enemies pop from the background for you to shoot down. You can use a basic shot or, surprisingly, a lock-on attack. Then when the boss comes in, the camera angle changes to a profile view of your dragon for boss fights. The game, however, lacks challenge, story, and is short on content, making for a very small game for a very big price. Sports. I'm very much not the person to talk to about sports. Never touch this stuff. Worse than crack. There is quite a few, but I couldn't tell you what the good ones are. Beat 'em up. Like fighters, this is a hard one to recommend for because of the screen issues and sprite size, but Streets of Rage is on the Game Gear, so do I really need to recommend you anything else? Now, should I get a Game Gear? I mean this in the nicest way possible, but for the majority of you,
fuck no, baby!
The Game Gear has a myriad of issues. Even if you're able to somehow find a working one that's well maintained, you're still stuck with a ticking time bomb. Everything on this handheld will fail at some point. Even if you replace the capacitors with ceramic ones, there are still some that can't be ceramic. Those will have to be replaced again in the future. The screen can fail in spite of perfectly fine capacitors, which means you'll need to do an IPS mod. This mod isn't as easy as it is on some systems, as you'll need to do an add-on for the board, which is an additional board. You'll have to learn how to solder, or have expendable income and trust internet strangers, and honestly, I would just rather die before I trust internet strangers. The game selection is just okay, and the coolest games on the system are in Japanese, so you'll either need a flash card or have to emulate them anyway. In general, buying a Game Gear comes with all sorts of additional costs regardless of your skill as a technician. This isn't a system that you can just buy and play immediately unless you buy one that's been modded already, and those are going to start at $200, but more commonly go for $300, which isn't horrible, but you can get a lot of other weird tech for that same price that's easier to repair. You could fully mod a GBA into the custom console of your dreams for that price and still have money left over. I'd say that if you're on the fence, try emulation and see if you like any of the games I mentioned first. That, or buy a broken Game Gear and don't repair it and use it as a display piece. I think most of you who buy and repair one won't play it past the first few weeks, so having one that's busted as a display piece is essentially the same thing. As for emulation, I would recommend the RG28XX. There's also a Powkiddy device that's shaped like a Game Gear, but I wouldn't recommend buying a device just for the fact that it looks like a Game Gear. I would say just buy the RG28XX if you're just wanting to be able to play these. It's $30 and it plays all sorts of stuff. Some PS1 stuff too, so like some PS1 and back, and it plays all that stuff, and it works perfectly fine, and it's super small. But that's really all I have for you right now. Despite recommending a lot of games here, the Game Gear is a system that I haven't explored all that much. Since mine is broken, I don't buy many games for it. I did some repairs on mine recently, replaced the capacitors with ceramic ones that will last longer, and the screen is still busted regardless. The soundboard needs to be replaced, and possibly the power board. I'm also waiting to get a custom shell, so I really am replacing everything but the motherboard. Really am doing that ship of Theseus. Anyway, with all this work to get it running, and the Game Gear being mostly backwards ports, where 16-bit is ported back to 8-bit, you might wonder why in the age of portable emulation would anyone ever bother to choose playing Game Gear over Genesis, let alone why would they bother repairing one? Well, that's a really good question. One that I should have asked myself a while ago. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you liked this video, then check out my blog, nimzynova.com. I post blog exclusives there, and I post exclusives here too. So make sure to check out both the blog and this channel for all sorts of neat gaming stuff. I'll be posting my repair of the Game Gear video there soon, and likely it won't become a video. Bye. Bye 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 bye.